In the late Soviet period, several hundred people were reported killed and a couple thousand injured in ethnic fighting. But who was to blame? Were these spontaneous events? Were they planned events? Who planned them? So the conspiracy argument goes back to Moscow. Did Moscow and its dependent republic elites have any reason to be happy about ethnic violence? And some have argued that the economic uncertainty of life without federalism was really highlighted by these ethnic fights. And so Moscow could actually use these ethnic fights to show that people are going to be worse off. And they also showed that they've got a major security problem without a strong center. So you need this federalist structure. And it gave the local elites a reason to crack down, put the police in the streets, put the military in the streets. So these were sort of the arguments that Moscow was fomenting all of this. But there are other potential reasons for ethnic tension. One of the big ones is structural. People had real grievances. There was a migration of ethnic groups. Some were favored, like the Slavs in particular. Slavs were favored in Central Asia. In Uzbekistan, there were rumors that the Turks, for example, got the best land for housing, the best jobs in cooperative farms. And so these sorts of things also contributed to this. Others suggest that this fighting may have actually been stoked by Moscow. Again, there were rumors that before the event happened, there were already rumors that were going around that they were going to happen. They so easily found victims, but often ethnics made sure that their own were also hurt, just to keep suspicions down. There were also similarity of cases across the region. So we had very similar sorts of ethnic violence. And there was the fact that this all appeared in the state-controlled media. The state-controlled media could have tried to avoid talking about all this, publicizing all of it, but it didn't. It actually stoked it, or it at least played it up. So the typical pattern in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan is that ethnic minorities were the ones who suffered. The Politburo, back in Moscow, then made a show of it, promising to increase aid, to decrease socioeconomic inspired tensions, and then the state media played up the bandit gangs, the criminal elements, who were often foreigners. They attacked those, quote, evil ones, who were using perestroika to push, quote, black goals of national consciousness. Often, it was the Ministry of Internal Affairs and not the Republic-level police who would move in on these quote-unquote hooligans. So, in other words, Moscow, the center, was trying to deal with this rather than letting the republics deal with it themselves. Of course, there are some serious dangers of this sort of strategy. You could actually create or heighten ethnic tensions that didn't exist or that were fairly minor before. It also places a strong hand in local politics at a time when the momentum, backed by the public, was increasingly expected more freedom. This could be used by the democratic opposition, in other words, within these local republics. And it also strengthened nationalists, moderate as well as the more extreme ones within these societies. These are the people who had more sympathy for those living under martial law. So this created nationalism to a certain extent. So this was one way in which, or several ways in which this could backfire, and did backfire in some of the republics. Now, elites, it's very clear, manipulated nationalism across Central Asia and across the Soviet Union. This was evident in the late perestroika period in various informal groups. In all of the countries, you had this glorification of pre-Russian past, state nationalism as opposed to class identification, redefining Russians from our older brothers to our colonizers. There was this demand for regaining ancient title to the homeland. In Turkmenistan, the picture you see here, Niyazov, who was the Communist Party first secretary, became really born again. He renamed himself Turkmenbashi, father of the Turkmen people. He created various state holidays, so you had Independence Day, but you also had a day of revival and unity. You also had the state flag day, which was on Niyazov's birthday. Despite having a huge diaspora, lots of Turkmen in Iran and Afghanistan in particular, Turkmenistan was sold as the homeland for everyone, for all the Turkmen around the world. The World Turkmen Humanities Association was created to encourage a return of Turkmen. Soviet history books were also tossed out. Turkmen and Central Asians in general were written up as backwards before the Russians came. They were nomads who happened upon Turkmenistan. And instead, you had the rewriting of these textbooks to describe the Turkmen as the descendants of the ancient Parthian civilization, They were indigenous to Turkmenistan. They weren't new to the region. They have a long 1,000 plus year history in the region. Strong links to the Oghuz Turks, these Western Turks. So they were now opponents of they were now no longer opponents of the Basmachis, but strong supporters of the Basmachis. Islam, which was tightly controlled by the state, became an important part of the identity. So all these things were reversed in the new history books. In Uzbekistan, same thing was going on. For Uzbeks, the new father of the Uzbek nation is one of the oldest, Tamerlan Timmer, known in the West as Tamerlan, who unified the Uzbeks back in the 14th century. In the Soviet era, Timur was portrayed as this bloodthirsty tyrant, and now the Uzbek state portrayed him as a great and wise ruler. And they now complain that the Soviets had dehumanized him. So there were new statues of Timur that were unveiled in parks and other public places. There was an Tamerlan Timur museum in Tashkent, which now receives soldiers and school children in much the same way, and the same sort of solemn climate that used to pervade Lenin's mausoleum in Moscow. There were attempts to criminalize the Russian and Soviet era. I found a truth commission that existed in the late 1990s, and the goal of this truth commission was actually to go and expose all of the bad things that the Russians had done, and show that it wasn't the communists who had done these things, because of course Karimov and other elites who were still in power after independence were communists, but it was actually the Russians who were doing it, making these connections between the Russian and the Soviet era. It's important to remember when we focus on Tamerlan and Tamerlan Timur that he was in charge of a centralized state. He was a strong ruler. And so playing him up really harkens back to the recreating of a great Timurid empire under Karimov, the president now. So this strong state. Also note that, conveniently, Timur was based in Samarkand, where Karimov and many of his clique are from. In Kazakhstan, it was more difficult to play up nationalism because you had so many Russians. You had such a heavy Russian population. But Nazarbayev and his people also harkened back to the mid-15th century Kazakh Khanate, and they played up revolutions or revolts. One in 1916 against the Tsarist conscription, which we talked about long ago. Another one, which I mentioned a few minutes ago. Then in 1986, when Moscow designated a Russian as the first secretary, and this led to revolts. So just a little more background on this. On December 12th, 1986, the Russians put forward this ethnic Russian who would be now the first secretary in Kazakhstan, as they were purging the Communist Party of Kazakhstan for corruption. And a large number of Kazakhs went out and they demonstrated, and these turned violent, these demonstrations. Well, now this became Independence Day. So December 12th in Kazakhstan is now Independence Day. In Kazakhstan, they also reinterpreted their history with Russia. So the treaties which acceded territory to Russians back in 1731 and 1740 were now said to be temporary alliances. This wasn't voluntary submission. This wasn't auto-colonization in any way. They also got rid of the imperial Kazakh city, Almaty, which as the capital. It still exists, it's just not the capital anymore. And they moved the capital to Astana, right in the middle of the country. And the cost was $1 billion plus. So this would serve as the new center of old Kazakhstan. In Kyrgyzstan, in 1995, they celebrated the 1000th anniversary of the epic Manas, a mythical hero who was said to have consolidated Kyrgyz tribes and united them in opposition to foreign conquerors. They created the Manas Mausoleum, which made him real. Now he was this real guy, and now he's got a burial spot. They also have an international airport named after him, parks named after him. In 2003, they celebrated the 2200th anniversary of Kyrgyz statehood. There had been Kyrgyz in Kyrgyzstan for all this time. They said they were at least loosely held together, and so therefore for 2200 years they had a state. They said there was a proto-nation then, the tribes of the Wusunis and the Gagunis, who were ancestors to modern-day Kyrgyz, were around, and they already spoke a common Kyrgyz language. And so all this made Kyrgyzstan the oldest state in Central Asia. So what better way to foment nationalism? Now in Tajikistan you had delayed nationalism because of the civil war. In 1999 though, they celebrated the 1100th anniversary of the Samanid state. There's a huge statue of Amir Ismail Samanid. Heading up to this statue, you can see right here are three alleys: the alley of the presidents, the alley of the heroes of the state, and the alley of the stars of poetry of the East. So again, this triumphant, this renewed interest in this triumphant summit. Again, all this started in the 1980s initially, with the establishment of a unique Tajik identity based on a long and distinguished prehistory. So the identification of historical injustices inflicted upon the Tajiks by extraneous forces became more and more pronounced. So they talked about the Arabs who committed these injustices on the Tajiks, the Turks, the Mongols, the Uzbeks, who, remember, took Samarkand and Bukhara, the Russians, obviously, and the Soviets. According to then-President Rakhmanov, who was president since 1994, the Tajiks were the original inhabitants of Central Asia. They were renowned for their, quote, wisdom, love for freedom, export of knowledge, dignity, etc., etc., etc. The Tajiks had to fight wars, but these were wars of a purely defensive nature, he said. The Tajiks had reached the heights of sovereign statehood prior to the Mongol invasion back in the 13th, 14th centuries. They never recovered quite from this Mongol invasion. And then, of course, the Great October Socialist Revolution gave the Tajiks statehood and a second life. Soviet rule, despite the massive injustices of the national delimitation, was beneficial for the rise of Tajik culture and self-awareness. A lot of this is direct quotes from Rachmanov. Then they finally gained independence in 1991, and this was this precious gift that became hijacked by power-hungry political adventurers. So this explains why you have the Civil War. After independence... Oh, I lost it, sorry. After independence, here, let me just get back to this. After independence, nationalism is manifested in across Central Asia. The titular language being the official one, the rebuilding of mosques, the upgrading of religion. So, for example, the Uzbek First Secretary is now sworn in on a Quran. The renaming of streets and towns, and we'll get to that in Tajikistan. Affirmative action, so promoting locals over the Slavs who dominated much of industry and parts of the state, the republic level. And reconsidering the past, sometimes criminalizing, sometimes rehabilitating, in other words, legally restoring the rights of course, now dead, once political enemies, but really national heroes. So great poets, great authors, great nationalists. All these sorts of things became common at the end of the Soviet rule and at the beginning especially of independence. So we'll stop there.